He is a professor of history at Exeter University. You have a fuller biography of him in your conference packs. He's here with his new book today, The Idea of Israel, A History of Power and Knowledge. Last evening, your book was described by our patron Abby Schlein as the best on the continued role of Zionist ideology. So perhaps you'll tell us a bit about that today, and of course we do want to hear your latest perspectives as well. So I now invite Ilan Pappe to come to the microphone, From Ethnic Cleansing Toward a Political Solution. Ilan, thank you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm really honored to be invited for the 10th anniversary celebration. As I'm honored to be a patron of this incredible movement, organization. I met Shoshana and Jeff, I think for the first time in 1977, when I quoted a very lovely young student in the Hebrew University who became my wife, because they were their neighbors. And we were all then engaged in trying to empower, if you remember, North African Jews who were living in poor neighborhoods, because we thought for some reason that the West Bank was not the real issue. Little did we know that we will meet here so many years after in different capacities. So it's kind of a closure, which is nice to see you all here. The main focus of my talk would be the term ethnic cleansing, and I think Jeff made a very important remark that ethnic cleansing is a legal term, and therefore if you accuse someone of practicing ethnic cleansing, you can, in theory at least, bring that someone, whether it's a state or a politician or an army general, you can bring them to court. Because it is defined as a crime against humanity. Of course, you cannot bring a whole state to a court, but there is a public court. There is a moral, ethical, international community, I would hope. And therefore, accusing Israel of practicing ethnic cleansing for so many years against so many Palestinians is not just a moral accusation, it has legal foundation. And I do agree with Jeff that Judaization is the kind of private name you give to the general term to make it even more, to make it correspond more easily to the realities on the ground. The ethnic cleansing, to my mind, is part of the Israeli DNA, the Israeli Jewish DNA. It's part of the Israeli Jewish DNA. And when you talk about ethnic cleansing, you have to understand, I would preface it by saying 3 short attributes about ethnic cleansing, which I think are important, and I think clarify what the Zionist movement did until 1948 and Israel did ever since 1948. The first thing about ethnic cleansing is that it is a perpetual kind of process. It never really ends until it totally collapses. It may have periods where it is low-key. It may have periods when ethnic cleansing becomes a dramatic, revolutionary event, but it becomes a way of life for those who want to get rid of the other ethnic group. And as long as the other ethnic group is there, ethnic cleansing is part of your thinking, of your strategy, of your policy, even if you don't articulate it every day as a master plan or a blueprint for how to deal with the Palestinians wherever they are. Ethnic cleansing is something most Israeli Jews are practicing, directly or indirectly, ever since the first Zionist settler came to Palestine in 1882. The presence of the Palestinians in Palestine was and is the biggest problem for the idea of a Jewish state. And there's no way around it. Unless you give up the idea of a Jewish state. Then there are many ways around it. But if you insist that Palestine has to be a Jewish state, you become an ethnic cleanser the moment you say that Palestine is a Jewish state. And it's amazing, it's such a simple truth. And in my last book, I was trying to show how successful were Zionist academics and diplomats, and then Israeli academics and diplomats, in selling us a story which says, no, it's far more complicated. It's far more complicated. It's not true that if you say that Palestine is a Jewish state, the Palestinians have no place there. But there's nothing in what they did to disprove that simple truth. There's a complex reality that developed as a result of the unsuccessful ethnic cleansing of Palestine. That is true. That definitely complicated life for everyone who lives there. But there's nothing complicated about the first Zionist settlers and whoever came after them and was in a position of power, and the idea we said Palestine is Jewish, used to be Jewish, the Palestinians are at best visitors, at worst they are invaders, usurpers of something that does not belong to them, and that depends on your humanity how you're going to deal with it. You can believe in transfer, namely kicking them out as the best solution, as most Zionist leaders up to 1948 believed and tried to practice in 1948. Or when things become more complicated, after 1948, you devise different means of maintaining the ethnic supremacy, if not purity. And that's the second point about ethnic cleansing. Quite surprisingly, Plan B for an ethnic cleansing, Plan A is clear, it's ethnic cleansing. You kick people out. Plan B for ethnic cleansing, when circumstances do not allow you to expel massively people, is not allowing them to leave the place where they are. Caging people in their villages, in their areas, not allowing them to expand in a spatial way, not allowing them to cultivate the land, but saying to them, this is Palestine, this little village of yours is Palestine, but you're not allowed to leave it. You're not allowed to expand it, is also ethnic cleansing. Because you keep them under supervision, in a prison, in their own homeland, but you make sure that your ethnic purity is not intoxicated, is not affected. And that's what Israel has been doing since 1948. In 1967, we have now the documents of 1967 open to us. The Israelis are still declassifying, interestingly, documents. Somehow they hope, and that's what my last book is about, somehow they hope that the scientific truth and the moral validity of Zionism would meet together. And one day a great group of scholars would say, scientifically, Zionism was correct. And I think that's one of the reasons they still declassify documents. And they can rely, as I write in my book, they can rely on Israeli academia. Most Israeli academics go to the archives and enter the archives, Zionists, and leave them Zionists. So they use the documents in order to validate the Zionist main argument, not to challenge it. But those who did challenge, like me, find themselves eventually in nice exile in southwest England. So it's not very conducive to challenge with documents the Zionist narrative. It's much better to challenge it out of intuitively or conceptually. That's less dangerous in the eyes of the Israelis. But if you claim that your challenge comes out of your research, that makes it more terrifying to the Israelis. Now, anyway, that was a by-side about the 67 documents. The 67 documents give us a view into the debates in the Israeli government immediately after the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Half of the government that had to decide what to do with the occupied territories, half of them, were young generals in 1948 who were involved in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, in the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians, the demolition of 500 villages, half of Palestine's villages, and half of Palestine towns. They became ministers in the 67 government. And it's not surprising that their point of view was Zionism finally has control over the whole of Eretz Israel, that is mandatory Palestine, and it does not have to incorporate the 1.5 million Palestinians who live there, because that would make sense. You kick out 1 million Palestinians, you don't want to include another 1.5 million because of the 67 war. So they said, why not do what we did in 1948? Let's kick them out. But half of the government were not ex-ethnic cleansers from 1948. They were more measured kind of politicians. The most important among them was Levi Eshkol, the prime minister, who said, you can't do it. You can't do in 67 what you did in 48. The war is over, first of all. In 48 we did it while the war was going on. Secondly, there's television today, he said. Thirdly, he was not sure that you can kick out people twice, because many of the Palestinians were refugees. So there was plan B offered by Yigal Allon. Let's just kick out the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and put them in the West Bank and then try to move them out, some of them to Jordan. They kept playing, and of course, eventually, the man who decided about Israeli strategy ever since then until, I would say, 1977, Moshe Dayan, said, no, there is a different way of doing it. We will never return, he said, the occupied territories. There's no need to think about that. But we can't kick out the Palestinians. But we can keep them as citizenless citizens. There's no harm in this. And he kind of devised, together with his nemesis, actually, but they had to cooperate, Yigal Allon, they devised the strategy for Israeli policies ever since. They said, let's divide, first of all, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to two parts. One that is obviously part of Israel. The end result of this is Area C today. The second part is where the Palestinians live. And remember, the Palestinians, if they are not allowed to move, as far as the Israelis are concerned, they're ethnically cleansed. Namely, they're not a problem. If they stay where they are, and they're not allowed to expand, and they're not allowed to connect, then the problem is solved. You don't have to expel them. And that's, if you want, is Area A and B today of the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, and the Gaza Strip. He also said, with the help of Abba Eban, of course, we don't have to propagate this as our strategy. We need to talk about peace. We need to do a peace process, and so on. But as Yigal Allon called it, we need to establish עובדות התיישבותיות, settlement facts, or something like that. I don't have any better translation for עובדות התיישבותיות. Namely, we don't have to negotiate everything. We have to establish facts on the ground that for us clarify which part of the West Bank, which territory we need, and which demography we don't need. The amazing thing is how we all in the world later on accepted this as a peace plan, as a kind of an impulse to reconcile with the Palestinians. This was a version of a mega prison, the biggest prison in the world. There was a kind of a soft version of this prison, if you want, an open prison. If the Palestinians accept it, behave well, they can even work out of prison. Maybe they can work in Israel. And maybe they're allowed to go out and in, in vacations. But if they are resistant, and they resisted every now and then a kind of an ultra-maximum prison is imposed on them, with demolition, with collective punishment, and I don't have to tell you everything you know that has happened, the repertoire of Israeli atrocities ever since 67. But I want to come back to my main point. The policy Israel exercised in 1967 is a direct continuation of the policy Israel exercised in 1948 and is direct result of the importance of ethnic cleansing in Zionist ideology. This is very important. You cannot resist what Israel is doing if you do not challenge the basic ideology on which the Jewish state is built. As hard as it may be, and as hard it may be because people would accuse you of anti-Semitism, people would say, don't you think the Jews have a right to a state of their own? And you probably know, and some of you may have heard, the sort of ready-made challenges to this point of view. But we don't only have to face the fact that the two-state solution has collapsed, we have to face the fact that the idea that there could be a state that is part of the civilized world, that is part of the Western world, and still claims that ethnic consideration of purity, of exclusivity, and supremacy is a legitimate state. This is not acceptable. For many reasons, the United States and the West say, yes, we can have a Jewish state which is racist, that is oppressive, that does to the Palestinians what it does, for all kinds of reasons. First, it was the Cold War, maybe it's the Holocaust. I don't want to analyze the Western legitimization of Israel. It deserves another lecture. But one can understand where it comes from. Of course, it's not a great riddle. But it's time to look at who was at the receiving end of this legitimization. And the time has come to ask ourselves, what does it mean to delegitimize it? Because if it is not delegitimized, if it is not stopped, as I said, ethnic cleansing doesn't stop until it achieves its absolute solution. So it will continue. The old, one of the targets inside Israel now is Old Acre. I don't know if you know about Old Acre. Lovely city, north of Haifa. 20,000 Palestinians are crammed into the old city of Acre and are in danger of being ethnically cleansed. Palestinians in the south of Israel have been ethnically cleansed as we speak, and are struggling very courageously and successfully so far against this idea. Greater Jerusalem area, the Galilee, it's not just the West Bank, it's not just the West Bank. There is a whole notion at the heart of the Zionist project which says, yes, we can tolerate the status quo as it is. That is true. If the Palestinians accept the reality as it is today, and would say, okay, this is the map for the next 50 years, I think most Israelis would agree with it. Namely, together with house demolition, political arrests, checkpoints, poverty, unemployment, and so on, whatever comes with it. But there is still a far more important notion at the heart of a Zionist perception of reality today, that without the Palestinians could have been much better. That Israel could not only survive, it would thrive. And this is such a poisonous way of looking at things. I have 2 boys in Israel, and I hear the teachers, I hear the friends. It's so embedded in the DNA. It's unbelievable. This idea that Palestinians are not just a security problem, they are the obstacle for our success. Life would have been very different. And even the peace camp in Israel has never liberated itself from this basic idea, because it kept saying, we want to be racist in a smaller part of Israel. Smaller meaning 80% of Palestine. That's all we want. But you understand, we don't want to be mixed. I live, when I am in Israel, in a lovely suburb called Tiv'on, in between Haifa and Nazareth. They all vote for merits. But unfortunately for Tiv'on, they are next to a village, a Palestinian village called Tabaun. And out of time, the 2 communities began a little bit intertwine. Palestinians who have money are trying to move into the Jewish neighborhood, and Jews who became poor try to move to the Palestinian neighborhood. So what do the nice peace campers in Tiv'on suggest? Building a wall. Of course. What else can you do? If nature means that people are not that different from each other, want to live together, that's the worst thing that can happen to Zionism. So you have to build a gate. Both a gate and of course a wall. So, I think it's very important to understand that although circumstances have changed since the first Zionist settler came to Palestine, the basic impulse to create a kind of an ideal type Jewish society is closely connected to the demographic problem, as Zionists and afterwards Israelis would call it. And the demographic problem, which by itself should be outlawed as a discourse in a civilized society, and is sanctified in Israel, especially by people on the peace camp. That's the main argument for leaving the West Bank. How can we, Shimon Peres got 2 Nobel Peace Prizes on this. How can we keep Israel a Jewish state by not having the West Bank? Meaning, hopefully, not enough Palestinians will be born in the area that we will stay in. Or, I don't know what, maybe Palestinians would convert to Judaism. Or Palestinians would disappear. And if they don't, maybe we'll even be willing to, give up more space. Just God forbid, don't allow us to be in a state that is mixed and has a large number of Palestinians in it. Now, in order to struggle against it in a practical manner, I want to connect to what Jeff was talking about. I think that I agree that the Kerry initiative, or the failure of the Kerry initiative, is a kind of an invitation to a funeral that already took place 2 years ago, when we were not told that the two-state solution died, and actually there was a funeral, but nobody invited us. So this is kind of a voice from the past. I totally agree, and I do agree that it creates not only a moment of chaos and danger, but also a moment of opportunity. And I think it's usually that way in history, when there is a realization that a certain perception of reality doesn't work. It is the chance of pushing forward new perceptions of reality. And unfortunately, sometimes the readiness to accept new perceptions of reality has to be accompanied by a big implosion. And I'm afraid that, despite Jeff didn't talk about it, I'm afraid that the collapse of the two-state solution, the collapse of the PA, would not be a tea party. It would be a very bloody event, unfortunately. But it is time for rethinking, reframing maybe the relationship between Jews and Palestinians on the ground. And there are 3 points with which I would like to end that are connected to this, if one accepts my analysis, that the main problem over the years is the ideological racist perception of Zionism. Not the security issues, not religion, not everything else that people like to throw in as explanations for why Palestinians and Israelis have been fighting each other for more than a century. Of course, there are other reasons. And there is involvement from the outside, there is the military industry. All of it plays a role, but I think it's important to get to the core of the problem. And I think that's the core of the problem. And at that moment, this dangerous moment of opportunity, one can call it this way, one has to do, to my mind, at least 3 things. One is to change the language. I think it's a bit ridiculous, and I don't want to offend anyone, but I think it's, even Jeff started to concede it, I think, when he was talking. I think it's a bit ridiculous to talk about the occupation. It's not a very useful term, the occupation. You don't occupy a place for 46 years when you exist only 19 years. It's like I have such, because of all kinds of marriages in my family, I have an uncle who's 7 years old. That's like saying that Israel, that there is occupation of the West Bank. Israel is 19-year-old kind of settler colonial state, hardly finishes its 2nd decade, and it occupies, and then it occupies another piece for another 46 years. That's not occupation. What is happening in the West Bank, especially after we saw this map is not accidental. This is the result of Israeli strategy. It didn't sort of happen to unfold this way. This is the end result of a strategy, not of the Israeli right. The Israeli right-wingers, by the way, muddled the map with the messianic idea that you should settle where the Palestinians were supposed to be enclaved. They really ruined for many Israeli strategies what the Labour Party wanted to do. But that's more or less the Labour Party map of '67. That's what they envisaged the West Bank to look like. That's not occupation. That's ethnic cleansing in different means. Part of it is annexation, and parts you annex, you do try to get rid of the unwanted population, and the other parts, you leave the unwanted population in a way that it cannot move. I heard an Israeli explanation by geographers who explained that the Palestinians don't like to move away out of their houses. They don't need, unlike the settlements, they don't need green spaces. They don't need spaces between houses. They like to live at the parameters of their houses because it fits the Israeli strategy. The Palestinians don't need any space. They just need housing. And that's why that's not occupation. This is the final phase of trying to create the impossible idea of a Jewish state instead of Palestine at the heart of the Arab world. It's not going to happen. It's not going to succeed. It can succeed for another 30, 40, 50 years. But history teaches us that alienated invaders do not have a chance in the long run. And Israel behaves like an alienating invader. It shouldn't be that way, but that's the way it is. So that's the first point. Changing the language. Occupation is not the right language, to my mind. As peace process is not the right language. Israel didn't occupy a state called Palestine, and the two states now have to reach a peace conclusion. The Jews are a settler colonialist society that have to come to terms with the native population of Palestine. There's a third generation of settlers, like in South Africa. These settlers have nowhere to go. They have to be part of the solution. They have to be part of the future. We have to find out what is the best way of reframing the relationship between the settlers and the natives. Respect their rights, their collective sensitivities, whatever. I'm not saying that I have a ready-made solution, but I think this should be the conversation. How do we, as Israeli Jews, get legitimacy from the Palestinians? Not how the Palestinians get legitimacy from us to stay in area A and B. It's the other way around. It's high time that we would ask the Palestinians, after all we did, after everything that happens, and nobody is as great as Ahmadinejad to suggest that we should go because we have nowhere to go. But what is the best political outfit? And Jeff rightly said we should leave all these options open. But at least that should be the conversation, reframing the relationship. Not on the basis of a peace process. That's the last important thing, peace. It's how to reconcile what you had done to the native population and your wish to be part of that country because I'm part of that country as well, even if my parents settled there in the 1930s. And definitely my children are part of that country. So how do we reframe it? It's a different conversation. It's not about peace. Maybe reconciliation, maybe truth and reconciliation comes to mind. And the last thing is, can we hope for an internal Israeli process that would come and say, yes, this is a moment of opportunity to rethink our racism, to rethink the apartheid system that we have built, to rethink the ethnic cleansing that we have done? Historically, unfortunately, the answer is that internal processes like this cannot happen by themselves. The only way of enhancing them, of making them effective, and you need a change from within. You will never be able to do it without a change from within. You need the pressure from the outside. And if you read even someone like the Guardian's correspondent in Israel who wrote yesterday an opinion editorial in the Guardian, a woman who had a long public debate with me many years ago against, she was totally against the BDS and so on. And she writes, she sees it now, that's okay, better late than never. She says, only boycotting Israel, including the Israeli academia, is probably the only way of sending the Israeli society a message that their policies, their ideologies, their perceptions of the world are immoral, are unacceptable, and there's a price tag attached to this kind of policies if they continue. I think even John Kerry said it, in a way, in warning the Israelis. And I think this is such an important moment in history where you need to strategize on all fronts in a way that would lead to the right conversation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. We have all the wrong conversations now going on between Israelis and Palestinians. So one is for the international community, not to be a venue for meetings between Israelis and Palestinians, but to be the hub of pressure on Israel, on the same model that pressured South Africa during the days of the apartheid. There's no, it's not a complicated issue. If academics rightly will tell you there are many differences and dissimilarities between apartheid, South Africa, and Israel, this is very fine for academic conferences, and we'll have these conferences, I promise you. But basically, from an activist point of view, the boycott is the same boycott, the pariah state is the same pariah state, and what the civil society wants the political elites to do is the same. So that's one arena. The second arena is inside Israel, and Jeff was talking about it. We need to get those Israelis who didn't walk the extra mile to get into the conversation, to leave behind these two-state solution, the idea of peace and so on, and to look at the mirror and says, I don't want to be part of this ideological outfit called Israel as it is. I want a regime change. That doesn't mean that I have to lose my homeland. It doesn't mean that I have to lose my Jewish identity. It just means that I'm not part of a racist ideology that has victimized Palestinians and also Jews for so many years. The Jewish community in the world has to divorce itself from Zionism as much as it can. Because otherwise, Zionism would have a very strong anchor that would be there. As Christian Zionism has to be challenged by Christian communities. And the Palestinians have a lot on their plate. They have to unify, they have to strategize, they have to defragment the Zionist fragmentation of themselves to different groups. Everyone has a lot to do. But I agree with Jeff, in the end of the day, all of these forces on the ground have to strategize jointly. But part of the exercise begins, I think, with language. Ethnic cleansing, apartheid, racism is part of, or settler colonialism, is part of the 4 new entries, if you want, in the new dictionary that has to replace the old dictionary of the peace process, the 2 states, the legitimate rights of both sides, and all this paradigm of parity that has perpetuated the suffering rather than bringing an end to it. Thank you.